Hello, this is lecture one, and the subject of this lecture is interdisciplinary approaches to human-animal relationships. So what I want to do in this first lecture of the course is really lay out some of the key questions that animate this course, some of the sort of big issues that we'll be addressing across the entire semester, and also start to talk a little bit about some of the things you've started to read and what kinds of theoretical tools they provide that we can hopefully apply to the various things that we read and watch throughout the semester. So that's our goal for this first lecture. Before we dig into that, I did want to take a few minutes just to talk about cultural anthropology, which is the discipline for this course. I'm a cultural anthropologist. I know not everybody who's taking this course has necessarily had anthropology before, so I wanted to start with a little bit of just some context for the nature of this academic field, how cultural anthropologists sort of approach things, and also how cultural anthropology intersects with other fields, because this course is grounded in cultural anthropology. That's sort of our primary location. But it's also a quite interdisciplinary course, so we'll also be looking at some other fields that sort of have ongoing conversations and relationships with cultural anthropology. So I just want to sort of sketch that out for you so you have a sense of where you are in terms of the discipline itself. So cultural anthropology is a qualitative social science. Some of the hallmarks of cultural anthropology that make it a little bit different than other social sciences are, first of all, the way we approach our studies and the kinds of methods that we use. The approach of cultural anthropologists is often described as the ethnographic method. What that means is that anthropologists locate themselves in the cultural world that they're interested in learning about. For many of us, that means doing extended field research, living in a community where we want to sort of learn about how people do things. So unlike some other social sciences, which may sort of engage with people by either bringing people into an academic space or engaging with them sort of remotely through things like survey instruments, instead of using those techniques, cultural anthropologists sort of go directly to the source, if you will, and embed themselves in the social world that they want to know something about, okay? What we produce through doing that is sometimes referred to as thick description. And what that means is that the writing of cultural anthropologists is often a very detailed, first-hand account of daily life in a particular cultural setting. So there's a sort of narrative and descriptive component to it that accompanies that sort of embedded ethnographic experience. So in other words, again, unlike other social sciences that might talk about their subjects in terms of, say, a statistical analysis, right? Instead, cultural anthropologists are going to tell stories that they heard from people in their field site, that they experienced themselves during that research process. And it's through that sort of accumulation of many stories and experiences that we identify some of the patterns of cultural life in a particular location and are able to then draw some conclusions and also present to our readers what those experiences, both for people living in that space and the anthropologists themselves, are like. So that's the way we sort of bring people into what it means to live in that particular cultural world. Now, cultural anthropology is only one of the subfields within the broader discipline of anthropology. So you see the graphic here on the slide. Anthropology is a broader discipline that takes a holistic approach, which means that as a whole, anthropology is interested in looking at what it means to be human from multiple perspectives. And one of the ways that we have those multiple perspectives is having these four different subfields that address this issue of human beingness from different vantage points. So you see cultural anthropology up there on the upper left is one of those subfields. And again, that's what we're doing in this course. But there are others. Biological anthropology, which looks at the human experience through a biological lens, particularly looking at things like human evolution and human variation. Linguistic anthropology, which is looking at human experience through the lens of language and language use. And archaeology, which is similar in a lot of ways to cultural anthropology. It's also interested in social life, right, and how people sort of find meaning in their lives. But the primary difference is that archaeology is interested in those social worlds from the past. So cultural anthropologists are going to go to a contemporary social world and be able to talk to people and watch what they do, etc., ask them questions. Archaeologists, because they're interested in societies that no longer exist or are from the past, are going to do so by excavating the remains of those societies and those communities. So in total, then, these four subfields, again, bring different sort of methods and theories and approaches to the same question of what it means to be human. And our idea is that when we bring all those perspectives together, we have this rich, sort of 360-degree holistic understanding, okay? So this course is a cultural anthropology course, but we are also going to look at some of the stuff from these other subfields that are particularly relevant to our subject. Particularly, coming up in the early part of the course, you'll be reading some archaeology. We know that people and dogs have a very long-standing relationship. And indeed, the evolution of the dog and the evolution of human beings are very much entwined, going back some 15,000 years or more. So that, understanding that part of that relationship, requires us to look to the archaeology, right? So there are all kinds of complements and intersections between cultural anthropology and the other subfields, and we will absolutely explore some of those complementarities in this course. The other thing I want to point out is that in addition to the sort of intersection among these subfields within anthropology, cultural anthropology also has all kinds of ongoing relationships with other academic disciplines. So cultural anthropologists tend to be quite interdisciplinary in their approach to their subjects. And you'll see that in this course as well. So not every single thing you read in this course is going to be by an anthropologist. A lot of it is. And again, I'm a cultural anthropologist, so I'm starting from that perspective. But because cultural anthropologists collaborate and sort of work together in a lot of different ways, or at least sort of trade ideas with scholars in other social sciences and humanities, we'll do that. Particularly because this subject, the subject of this course, really lends itself to that interdisciplinary approach, right? Lots of different fields work on this question of the relationship between people and animals, particularly people and dogs. So it behooves us to, again, not be rigid and just looking at the anthropology, but look at all those places where these sort of complementary, interdisciplinary approaches to things can enlighten us about the subject. So, for example, in this course, we will look at some history. You'll read some work by philosophers, particularly on questions of ethics around animals and animal-human relationships. We'll look at some literature in terms of how we write about animals and animals' experiences. So it's a sort of a cultural anthropology course with some interdisciplinary leanings, I think is the best way to characterize it. So that's, again, just a little bit of context on the nature of the field that we're starting from and a little bit of a roadmap to some of the places we'll go within this course. Okay. So let's talk a little bit then, as I suggested, about some of the big ideas and big themes that we'll be addressing in this course. And then, again, we'll take a little bit of time to talk about those first couple of readings that you looked at that provide some theoretical tools from anthropology that we can apply to our subject. I already alluded to the fact that the relationship between humans and dogs is very historically deep. We know from archaeological evidence that, and genetic and other kinds of evidence, that the relationship between humans and dogs stretches back at least 15,000 years, and there's some more recent evidence that it's considerably longer than that, even. Dogs were the first animals domesticated by humans. And we have lots of evidence that our physical and social evolutions are closely entwined. That is, what it means to be dog and what it means to be human owes a lot to the other species in that relationship. Dogs would not be dogs without their long-standing relationship with humans. But also, and this is an important part of it, humans would not be humans as we know ourselves without that long-standing relationship with dogs. So one of the things I think is going to be really important in this course is to sort of try to recognize that partnership as a partnership between two equally important players. So we're not going to be human-centric in our approach to this subject. We want to also understand that humans owe as much to dogs as dogs do to humans. Now, that said, and this is a very interesting place to start, right? This question of sort of evolution, both human and dog evolution. But the other thing that I want to make sure remains on the table is that we're going to be looking at, again, both what it means to be a dog and what it means to be a human and what dog-human relationships mean or are like, but not just from a biological perspective, right? We want to look at those sort of evolutionary questions. But there are also lots of other theoretical approaches that are really more interested in some of the sort of social significance of how we think about what it means to be a dog and a person, right? So we're not going to be just looking at things like DNA or what we can excavate that shows us what happened in the past, but also in the present, what it means to think about the frameworks of animalhood and personhood and those co-constituting relationships between people and other kinds of species, particularly dogs. So, for example, there are some scholars, particularly in the humanities, who argue that we really need to think about humans and animals as constituting one another. Again, this idea that it's not that a dog is sort of a sidebar or an add-on to what it means to be human, but that humanness and animalness are mutually constituting. You can't have one without the other. We didn't have one without the other. So this approach is one that challenges some sort of long-standing assumptions, particularly in Western thinking and Western knowledge. Some of those ideas that this approach I'm describing challenges are ideas from sort of, canonical Western thinking, like that of Descartes, that suggests that the human is the sort of dominant and superior form in the natural landscape. That is a kind of approach that reduces animals to sort of unthinking machines, right? Which supposedly have no self-knowledge, no rationality, right? So this is a set of assumptions that that privileges humanness as superior and sort of at the apex of what it means to be in the world. This is a kind of approach that also makes a clear distinction between nature and culture, right? Suggesting that humans and sort of personhood are in some qualitative way fundamentally different than animalhood. And that animals then are lesser beings, akin more to sort of possessions of humans than partners of humans, right? So the humanities scholars that I'm alluding to, and one sort of very significant scholar in this category that I'm describing is a scholar named Donna Haraway, are challenging that notion of hierarchy with humans at the apex and animals as sort of unthinking machines that are sort of either possessions of humans or simply lower down on the hierarchy and not sort of worthy of consideration in the same way that we consider what it means to be human. So Haraway is one of these sort of critical humanities scholars, has suggested that, in fact, dogs are not objects of humans, but are subjects in their own rights, and that both the subjectivity, right, the way that we understand ourselves in the world, and our personhood, what it means to be a human being, are dependent on or are completely entwined with animalhood and what it means to be a dog, right? In the case of Haraway, who's written about a bunch of different kinds of animals and animal-human relationships, but particularly has focused on dogs. So Haraway wrote, among many other things, she's a prolific author, a book called The Companion Species Manifesto, which is really about dogs as what she calls significant others to humans. This is actually a picture of her on the bottom with her dog, who she writes about a lot in this book and some of her other publications. So again, sort of refiguring this long-standing assumption in Western thought about hierarchies and relationships across species, and suggesting that we need to approach this in a different way. So Haraway's work is a sort of fundamental challenge to the distinction between nature and culture, a divide that would put dogs and humans in sort of different categories fundamentally. So contrary to that, what Haraway says is, and there's a quote here from her on the slide, is that dogs are about the inescapable contradictory story of relationships, co-constitutive relationships in which none of the partners pre-exist the relating, and the relating is never done once and for all, right? So not separate, but in fact part and parcel of one another's existence, and of the sort of both self-recognized and other recognized categories by which we sort of, again, understand our worlds. So Haraway's not arguing that people and dogs are the same, right? I mean, again, one of the sort of key phrases, even in the title of this book, is significant otherness, right? So she understands that dogs are different than humans, but that there's also this idea of a partnership there, right? And that particularly these companion animals, right, domestic animals that we spend a sort of a lot of intimate time with, are what she calls full partners in creating the human worlds that we inhabit. Okay, so again, Haraway's been sort of making these arguments for a long time. She's a very interesting thinker and writer, and she's one of those folks that I think the questions that she has raised in this kind of approach is something that's important to this course, and is definitely one of those big issues that we will continue to explore over these next 8 weeks. Okay, so Haraway's in the humanities. Haraway's not an anthropologist. She's an important thinker in these sort of interspecies scholarly approaches. So I definitely wanted to touch on what she does. But again, this is primarily a cultural anthropology course. So I also want to talk about some of the key theoretical and methodological approaches in cultural anthropology, of which you have started reading some. So this is also where we can unpack a little bit some of the stuff that you read in this first part of the course. These sort of interspecies or multi-species approaches in anthropology are relatively recent. So it's really in the last sort of 10 plus years in anthropology that we see more and more, 10 to 15 years, I'd say, that we see more and more of this kind of work coming out of cultural anthropology. So it's an exciting, relatively new thread in the work of cultural anthropologists. And some of the stuff you read is very much sort of at the cusp of this sort of new direction. So these approaches, some of the ways of framing these approaches are these that I've listed here on the slide. So you guys read a Kirksey and Helmreich article that puts forward this idea of multi-species ethnography, right? You'll read, not in this first section, but a little bit later in the course, the work of an anthropologist named Cohn, who talks about the anthropology of life, and really about, again, people interacting with and sort of cohabiting with the natural world, including dogs, but other animals and other kinds of species as well. And then you also read an excerpt of the Govindrajan where she talks about the concept of relatedness, particularly relatedness between people and the animals that are their close partners in life. So these are some of those, again, sort of theoretical tools and constructs that anthropologists are using. So Kirksey and Helmreich, in talking about multi-species ethnography, describe it as an approach that involves thinking through and against nature-culture dichotomies, right? Back to what I was talking about with Haraway's work, really challenging those sort of Western assumptions about that distinction between nature and culture, and instead exploring the places where nature and culture meet, some of those sort of muddy borderlands, where something or someone is neither fully nature nor fully culture, right? But sort of riding that divide. That's what multi-species ethnography is really interested in. And further, this is an approach that wants to address the lives of animals in a way that's not that dissimilar from the way cultural anthropologists address the lives of people, right? So understanding that animals have what they call legibly biographical and political lives. So figuring out precisely how to tell those sort of biographies of animals is another challenge, and one we'll also take on in this course. But Kirksey and Helmreich are suggesting that it's important that we figure out how to do so, because giving short shrift to the animals that are part of these sort of social landscapes that we're investigating is, they suggest, sort of leaving important things off the table, right? The other piece that you read is an excerpt from the book Animal Intimacies by Govindrajan. This is the cover of the book on the right here. And she is doing something that is also sort of in that vein of the multi-species ethnography, and employing this concept of relatedness. As she starts to describe in the part of the book that you read, her work is based on long-term field research in India, where she spent a lot of time in villages with people who live sort of, again, in partnership, in close contact with animals, right? With domestic animals that are very much part of the everyday there. And so, you know, she recognized the importance of animals and animal-human relationships in this particular cultural world where she was spending time. And what she writes about in the book is really about how recognizing the importance of those relationships informed the methods she applied to her study and the way she wrote up her findings in this book, right? So in other words, she realized that she needed to sort of relate to the animals in her field site in a way that was not that different than the way she related to people, right? To treating them as sort of full beings with distinctive lives, and trying to focus on those both individual humans and individual animals and their relationships, and sort of tell their unique stories. So recognizing the lives of individual animals as unique, not just part of the sort of category of animals. So again, a sort of biographical approach to animal experiences. Basically, Govindrajan, in the way that she does her research, so the methods she's employing, and also in the way she writes, she's taking her cue from the people in the villages where she worked, right? She says in the book that the people she worked with believed that non-human animals were intentional and subjective persons like themselves, and that relationships with them could be successful only if they emerged from that recognition. So she takes that perspective seriously and applies it to how she does her work as an anthropologist. And the result is this book, Animal Intimacies, again, that you read just the first piece of. If you're interested in it, it's a great book. I recommend it. We're not going to read the rest in this class. But this is another excellent example of that sort of multi-species ethnographic approach coming out of recent anthropology. Now, this idea that humans and animals, and again, for the purposes of this course, especially humans and dogs, sort of co-constitute one another, right? That their lives are complementary, and that essentially entangled and entwined in a way that it's impossible to fully tease them apart. That also creates a certain amount of ambiguity, right? About what it means to be a human, or what it means to be, in this case, a dog, right? It creates this sort of in-betweenness or hybridity. So dogs, we know, and this is something we can recognize across many cultural spheres and academic disciplines, dogs often appear, for example, in folklore, as sort of liminal figures, meaning sort of in-between figures, or tricksters even. So dogs are often recognized, even sort of beyond this scholarship, as being sort of betwixt and between, not quite wild and not quite domestic, not quite a part of the animal sphere and not quite a part of the human sphere, sort of between nature and culture, between subject and object. And that idea of the sort of the liminality of dogs, right, is another sort of theme that we'll address. To take a step back for a sec, particularly for those of you who haven't taken anthropology before, liminality is a really useful concept in anthropology. It has been most used in anthropology as associated with the anthropologist Victor Turner, who appears on the right side of the slide here, who wasn't writing about dogs. He was an anthropologist of religion, but he made good use of this concept of liminality to describe a state of betweenness, right? What he says, the quote from him here on the slide is, "The attributes of liminality are necessarily ambiguous. Liminal entities are neither here nor there. They are betwixt and between the positions assigned and arrayed by law, custom, convention, and ceremonial." Turner was an anthropologist of religion, and he was really interested particularly in ritual. And he used this concept of liminality, especially to describe rites of passage. That is, rituals where people are transitioning from one status in life to another. So, for example, in many societies, including in many communities within U.S. society, we find that there's some kind of ritual event in adolescence. Like young teenagers go through some kind of moment where there's a lot of sort of celebration and costumes and music, and it's a moment to mark their transition from being sort of children to adults or pseudo-adults, right? And Turner analyzed those rites of passage, and one of the things he recognized is that that transition often included this sort of liminal phase where young people are sort of in between. And it may be that in that in-between state, they wear crazy clothes, or they get to go to parties where people do all kinds of unexpected things, or they're separated from society where they learn secret knowledge, or whatever it may be, right? There's different things going on in different cultural contexts, but that often people go through some kind of liminal betwixt and between phase in a moment of transition, right? So that context, that concept of liminality is also really important for thinking about what we're talking about here, right? This sort of hybridity of animalness and personhood, and particularly the figure of the domesticated animal, and maybe even especially within that category, the dog, right? Which has so long been a companion to humans that, again, it's almost hard to categorize them or to figure out where the human elements of the dog begin and the animal elements of the dog end, right? So that in-betweenness, that hybridity, that ambiguity is another really important sort of theme and quality of dogs that inform the way that dogs and humans interact. So anthropologists have long recognized, again, owing to anthropologists like Victor Turner, that liminality is a powerful state and also a productive state, right? In other words, it changes things in the world. It makes things happen. So that liminality then is also about sort of the potency of the dog-human relationship and the dog in human society, right? So the dog and the way that dogs interact with humans sort of blur those categories, those species categories, and they point out both the limitations of our categories, right? That they don't quite capture what is going on, and also expand sort of the possibilities for how we conceptualize what it means to be human or what it means to be dog. So again, the ambiguity is not a sign of just a lack of understanding of what's going on. It's more a sign of the powerfulness of that particular kind of relationship and this particular question about that kind of relationship. One of the other things you read, the sort of brief Thornburg piece about dogs, also gets at that idea of sort of liminality and ambiguity. Thornburg talks, in fact, about the sort of contradictory roles of dogs as being sort of in between wild and domestic. And Thornburg's piece is really talking about dogs in the context of the Anthropocene, right? It's in a book, an edited volume about the Anthropocene, which is a way to refer to the current historical era as being one in which the world has been fundamentally changed by human behavior and human intervention. So Thornburg in that piece is really talking about dogs as sort of on the margins of the Anthropocene, and in some ways as human-made entities, but also as entities that change humans and that tie humans still somehow to nature or to the wild, to the undomesticated. So again, that ambiguity is a sign of the power of that particular juncture of relationships between people and dogs. And I think a sign that what we're studying in this course is exciting and important, right? That we're going to a place in the sort of social landscape where there's tension, where there's a sort of lack of clarity, but a lot of important questions are raised. So when you see something like that sort of complicated, unresolved place in a social landscape, it's a good thing to study. So that's what we're going to be doing in this class. Okay. So I want to end then on, I guess, what I'd call one of the final big themes for the course. And I think it emerges from what I've already been talking about in this lecture, right? That sort of ambiguity, the sort of both and nature of dogs and humans, right? That they're sort of clearly connected in all kinds of ways, and yet our sort of categories don't fully capture the nature of that interconnectedness. So what I also want to suggest is that there is an ongoing tension between human and dog, both closeness on one hand and distance on the other hand, in contemporary society. We know that pets in general, dogs in particular, are a really important fundamental part of U.S. society and many other societies, but for the moment I'm going to talk about the U.S. More than 60% of American households include dogs, and among those are 90 million, or include pets, and among those are 90 million dogs in the U.S. It's a huge industry. Americans spend more than $60 billion a year taking care of those pets. And around 3 million dogs enter shelters every year. So these are sort of unwanted or uncared for dogs. And of those millions of dogs, a significant percentage are euthanized. The euthanasia numbers for animals in shelters have actually gone down significantly in the last 10 years for a host of reasons. So the numbers are actually much better than they used to be. It used to be the majority of animals that went into shelters were euthanized. And yet, even with these much better numbers, we still find, for example, in a city like Chicago, that of the thousands of dogs that go into the public dog pound, right, which is called Chicago Animal Care and Control every year, at least 20% are euthanized. Depends on the year. A little bit later in the course, we'll have a discussion about this, and I'll have you look at some of the data from the Chicago dog pound. So again, there's that tension or that question. We consider dogs at least partners, often family members even. We treat them as such in many circumstances. And we have a tremendous number of sort of unwanted dogs or uncared for dogs. And one of the primary tools we use to address that is euthanasia. So that feels like a question we want to explore, right? And this is really, when we get to this question, is really also when we'll get into reading more of the sort of animal ethics and animal rights literature coming out of philosophy and other fields, which, sort of is trying to get into, all those, again, ethical and moral questions about what is a dog and what are the implications, particularly of how we treat marginalized dogs, right? So we have this real dichotomy between sort of the image of the pampered pet who's treated like a baby and gets everything, and dogs on the street who, again, are living under extreme duress on the street, and then when they are taken in, again, 1 out of 5 or so need to be put down. So to me, that sort of tension, I've sort of summed up on the bottom of the slide here. So on the one hand, we have these sort of interspecies and multi-species approaches in anthropology and other fields that are really looking at the ways in which animals and humans intersect, overlap, even co-constitute one another, right? So that's about our closeness. In some cases, even sort of our oneness. On the other hand, the same societies that are producing this literature, we also have a public shelter system in place and operating that feels like it's precisely about the disjuncture between what it means to be a human and what it means to be a dog, right? So if the first set of issues is really about understanding the category between animal and dog to be complementary and even overlapping, I think our public shelter system is precisely about reasserting that divide, right? Partitioning those two categories and making a clear distinction between what it means to be one of those species and what it means to be the other species. So in those public shelters, animals, and especially dogs, there's a lot of cats in there too, and other animals, right? We're not going to talk about cats just because there's not enough room in the course, but dogs in those shelters are really being treated as anti-society, right? Far from being sort of the complementary, interspecies partners of humans, as really being anti-society, and being objects of control, and needing to be destroyed in order to sort of sanitize a society of this sort of problem, quote unquote, of the stray dog. Again, this I think is a really interesting question for us to pursue over the course of our time together in this class. How can we reconcile, or maybe we can't, right? But how might we think about those sort of two sides of that coin, right? Those questions of closeness and overlap and interaction, and public policies that are sort of precisely about the opposite of that, okay? So, again, these are just some big questions that we'll sort of work on for the next 8 weeks or so, and probably none of these questions have one definitive answer, but I think it will be exciting to think through these issues and do a bunch of reading and watching of films and writing about all these subjects, to at least pull out some more ideas to help us understand what we think about all these questions, and how it might encourage us to think either about our own dogs or other dogs we encounter, and about the particular human world that we're a part of. So I will close it there. Enjoy the reading and the films, and we'll talk again soon. Bye-bye.